Do 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 do. All right, so I tried to. I'm trying to multi-stream to YouTube and Twitch, but not. I'm not gonna do TikTok and X today because we're having issues over there. So let me see. All right, let me post my links. Couple books, video game history. Imperialism and all right, posting my links, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen. Books, books, books. Alright, so let me copy and paste these links and we're good to go, y'all. Alright, how's everybody doing today? I am live, I think. Live. Hello. Sorry about that. I'm live. I'm ready. Alright, guys, so hope everyone's having a great day. It's Wednesday. I'm currently reading 50 Key Video Games, and I'm currently reading Sandinistas Speak. This is about United States imperialism in Nicaragua. I'm going to start off here, guys, and then we're going to maybe read about 10 or so pages. We're going to start where we left off. And we're currently on chapter 4, I believe, Nicaragua Strategy of Victory. So this book is a real eye-opener. Just a quick recap of where we're at. The United States backed the Somoza dictatorship for 50 some odd years. They made the common folk, the working class, extremely poor, destitute, and the elites kept all the riches for themselves and the mega transnational corporations worldwide. So there's a lot of harrowing statistics in here, guys. But what's cool is you get interviews from the mouth of Nicaragua's own, their revolutionary movement, the Sandinistas. So it's just neat to get a perspective that's not like from corporate news in the United States. And we are right now we're in the middle of a chapter because it was so long. We're reading an interview with Daniel Ortega. We're on page 63, I believe. Let's see. Yeah, so how many pages can we read today? Let's see. All right, maybe we can get to the next chapter. Oh, shit. Dude, my book is falling apart. Look at this. Fuck. All right, let's just dive in, baby. I'm ready for this. Y'all ready? Test. So, all right. Let's continue reading Sandinistas Speak. Interview with Daniel Ortega, page 63. Let's see. And I'm going to say Hardnecker, that is the interviewer. Ortega is the interviewee, okay? Let's begin. Hardnecker asks, wouldn't the fact that you had to withdraw from the captured cities be considered a failure? Ortega replies, no, not at all. Because we took the cities, seized the weapons of the National Guard, overpowered them, harassed the enemy, and kept on hitting them every chance we got. Everybody stayed in or around the cities. By then, the Carlos Fonseca column was operating in the northern part of the country without having suffered a single tactical defeat. At the same time, the guerrilla forces of the Pablo Ubeda column, operating in the mountain areas, were able to get back together due to a respite in the intense pressure that the National Guard had been putting on them. The guerrilla movement in Nueva Segovia had much more effect on the vital economic, social, and political centers because it was operating nearer to them. But it was the traditional guerrilla movement and the movement in the mountains that made possible the growth in the moral and political hegemony of the Sandinista movement until October. In other words, October was the continuation of the armed struggle mainly in the mountains because that was what the existing operational conditions called for. But the time came when the armed struggle had to be transferred to zones of greater political importance. It wasn't a question of storing away what we had accumulated, but of reproducing it. If we remained there, we'd be holding on to what we had, but if we moved to other zones, we'd be reproducing ourselves. The greatest expression of the impact of the February actions is the insurrection of the Indians in... Sorry, I need to mute my phone 1 second. Just make sure. Okay. The Indians in Monimbo. Monimbo? It was the first of its kind, organized and planned ahead of time by the Indians and Sandinistas who were there. The battle lasted for almost a whole week, until February 26. The enemy crushed that uprising, which is partial. Harnecker asked. You mean it was the only one in the whole country? Ortega. Yes, but at the same time, that partial uprising was the soul of the masses on a nationwide scale, and became the heart of the insurrection that was to take place throughout the country. Harnecker. When you were planning the Monimbo uprising, weren't you aware of the limitations of an isolated action? Ortega. But we didn't plan the uprising. We just took the lead in the action that was decided upon by the Indian community. The Monimbo uprising began around February 20th and continued for about a week. The capture of several cities, Rivas in Granada, for example, and the action carried out by the Northern Front had aroused a feeling of great expectation, of agitation among the masses. And the insurrectional propaganda spread by the FSLN, beginning in October through pamphlets, etc., distributed throughout the country, was beginning to bear fruit. The vanguard, however, wasn't able to make contact in a more organic form with those sectors of the masses with the greatest political awareness. The actions of that sector, encouraged by the telling blows dealt the National Guard by the FSLN in the midst of the Somoza regime's political crisis and the country's social and economic problems, surpassed the vanguard's capacity to channel all that popular agitation. The neighborhood of Monimbo, which is a district of Masaya with some 20,000 inhabitants in both urban and rural zones, began in a spontaneous fashion to prepare for the insurrection. They began to organize block by block, set up barricades around the whole district, and take over the key spots. They also began to execute henchmen of the regime to apply people's justice for the first time. They began to work as a Sandinista unit when they still lacked the organized leadership of the Sandinista movement. And this doesn't mean that there were no Sandinistas there. There certainly were, and that's precisely why Camilo Ortega went to Monimbo, with contacts we had there, to try to lead the uprising, and he was killed in the fighting. Harnecker. I understand now. Therefore, it was not an uprising that you had planned. Now then, would you have stopped it if you had been able to do so? Ortega. It would have been very difficult to do that, because the uprising responded to the objective development of the community. Of course, in keeping with our plans, maybe we would have postponed it or planned it differently. Maybe we wouldn't have organized an armed insurrection, but rather some other kind of mass activity. But that's the way things turned out. This was the way this Indian sector responded immediately to the incentive provided by the capture of the cities by the FSLN several days before. In late February, the organization of the vanguard was still limited, and we didn't have the cadres to channel the determination and fighting spirit that existed among the masses. Harnecker. An isolated uprising like that one meant that the enemy could concentrate all its forces against it. Ortega. Exactly, and that's something we learned by experience. Harnecker. Then it's important to know about other historical experiences in order to avoid making mistakes. Ortega. Of course, we the vanguard knew of these historical experiences, but the masses didn't. Harnecker. So it was actually a lesson for the people. Ortega. Yes, we the vanguard knew it from the classics. The principle of concentration of forces has been one of the basic principles in warfare since ancient times. What's important is that in our case, we went through that experience in spite of the vanguard. The vanguard were certain that the uprising would be a setback, but a setback that would be transitory, because the decision of Monimbo contributed to raising the morale of the rest of the people who joined the uprising. To what extent can the action be considered to have been a historical mistake? To what extent was the action an error on the part of the people, or was it simply their only option at the time? The fact remains that that example contributed both nationally and internationally to the development and ultimate triumph of the insurrection. Perhaps without that painful step, which entailed great sacrifice, it would have been more difficult to achieve that moral authority, that arousal among the country's masses, that spirit of support for one another that came from having witnessed how they had sacrificed themselves to win the support of the whole world for a people that were waging a struggle single-handed. Perhaps without that example would have been more difficult to speed up the conditions for the uprising. That was an experience we and the people learned from. With the experience we had acquired from October to Monimbo, we were able to verify that the masses were willing to stage an uprising. But they needed more military organization, more mass organization. There was a need for riper political conditions. And there was a need for more agitation. For better means of propaganda, such as a clandestine radio station. It was necessary to mobilize the masses for war through the most elementary forms of organization. Harnecker. You began to consider the matter of the radio station then? Ortega. We'd been thinking about it since October, but we hadn't been able to set it up. We had a radio set that the first anti-Somoza fighters had used in 1960, but it was old and we weren't able to put it in working order at that time. However, we managed to fix it later, and we put it in operation in those months of 1978. It was heard in Rivas, but very faintly. By then, we were fully aware of the need for a radio station, of a way to communicate with the masses in order to prepare them for the insurrection. But to get back to the idea I was developing, a gradual strengthening of forces was achieved amidst an enormous amount of activity that included the execution of General Regualdo Pérez Vega, Chief of the General Staff of the National Guard, the capture of the palace in August. There's an asterisk, let's read it. In August 1978, 25 FSLN guerrillas took over the National Palace and held hostage more than 60 members of Somoza's puppet chamber of deputies. They succeeded in winning the release of 60 political prisoners, having 3 Sandinista communiques read over the radio, and obtaining a large ransom. Very cool. All right, back. And winding up the first stage of this insurrectional movement that had begun in October 1977, with the nationwide uprising in September 1978. Harnecker. At that time, when you had issued a call for the uprising, did you think it would be successful? Ortega. We issued a call for the uprising, a series of events of objective conditions came up all of a sudden that prevented us from being better prepared. We could not stop the insurrection. The mass movement went beyond the vanguard's capacity to take the lead. We certainly could not oppose that mass movement, stop that avalanche. On the contrary, we had to put ourselves at the forefront in order to lead it and channel it to a certain extent. In this sense, the vanguard, aware of its limitations, decided to adopt the general decision taken by the masses, a general decision that was based on the example of the Indians of Monimbo, who, in turn, had been inspired by the example of the vanguard. In other words, the vanguard set the example in October. The masses followed suit for the first time in an organized fashion in Monimbo. The vanguard created the conditions on the basis of that example, and the masses moved faster than the vanguard because a whole series of objective conditions existed, such as the social crisis, the economic crisis, and the political crisis of the Somoza regime. And since the regime was in such a state of decomposition, every one of our actions far surpassed the impact we expected would result from them. But we had to keep on hitting. It was very difficult to hit the target. We hit it, but it wasn't precisely a bullseye. We were inspired by a spirit of victory, but we were aware of our limitations. We knew that it would be difficult to win, but we had to wage the struggle with that kind of spirit, because it's only with that spirit that people are prepared to shed their blood. Furthermore, if we didn't organize that mass movement, it would have fallen into general anarchy. In other words, the vanguard's decision to call for the uprising in September made it possible to harness the avalanche, to organize the uprising for the victory that was to follow. Harnecker. What conditions were ripe for insurrection? Ortega. The objective conditions of social and political crisis existed, but the conditions of the vanguard in terms of the organizational level to lead the masses, and especially in terms of weapons, did not exist. We didn't have the necessary weapons, but everything else was right. Harnecker. There was a very significant economic crisis, but Somoza still held many elements of power, chiefly the army. Ortega. Right, exactly, the army. And we didn't have the experience of participating in a national uprising. The training such an experience gives the masses and the knowledge of the enemy who showed up all his weaknesses. We didn't have enough weapons, but we did know that even if the uprising was not victorious, it would be a blow from which the regime would never recover. We were absolutely convinced of this, and so great was our conviction that a month later we were already calling for insurrection again. There were some comrades on the left who held the view that September practically negated all possibility of a short-term victory, that the operations had been a strategic mistake, a defeat, and they thus had delayed the day of victory. They were mistaken because September was not a victory, but it wasn't a defeat in strategic terms either. It was a historical achievement with both positive and negative aspects. Harnecker. So what is the final verdict then? Ortega. That it was an accomplishment because we grew as a vanguard. 150 men participated in that uprising, and our forces were multiplied several times over, 3 or 4-fold, plus the potential for recruiting thousands of others. We grew in size and in firepower because we captured weapons from the enemy. The vanguard suffered very few casualties. There were people killed as a result of Somoza's genocide, but very few cadres were killed in combat. In other words, we were able to preserve our strength. Harnecker. What is your verdict from the military standpoint? Ortega. We preserved our forces, acquired military experience, captured weapons, learned about the enemy, and destroyed some of the enemy's means of mobilization, including armored vehicles. The enemy suffered more casualties than we did. The people had a hand in this, as did our own firepower, and we were able to retreat. This is a great lesson, successfully. For the first time, we were able to engage military maneuvers, pulling back to other places in the city and countryside to accumulate forces for the new insurrectional struggles of an offensive nature which soon materialized. So we can't say it was a defeat. It would have been a defeat if they had exterminated us, if they had seized all our weapons, if we had been broken up and dispersed. It was not a military victory since we were unable to capture the garrisons in the 5 cities where there was a fighting, but it was a significant political accomplishment. I repeat, we called for insurrection because all of the political situation which had developed, and to prevent the people from being massacred alone, because the people, just like they did in Monimbo, were taking the streets on their own. Harnecker, wouldn't the people have been massacred just the same, with or without you? Ortega, no. It would have been worse, because at least we channeled the will of the people, just as happened in Monimbo, but on a much larger scale. That's why I told you we went forward. We never went around in circles. In the final stages, the peasants came down to join the struggle in the cities. In Chinandega, the safe houses were filled with people taking 3-hour classes. The people were going to take to the street. The people were the ones in the vanguard of that struggle. There was no alternative but to put oneself at the head of that upsurge and to try to obtain the most positive outcome. We placed ourselves at the head of that movement and led it in 5 cities. It was the first national uprising led by the FSLN, but that was chiefly due to pressure by the masses. Harnecker, you mean that on calling for insurrection you took into account, above all, the mood of the masses? Ortega, that's right, because the morale was high and became higher when the palace was captured in August. That paved the way for the September insurrection. Harnecker, when you planned to capture the palace, did you consider the impact this would have on the masses? Ortega, we knew the mass movement was coming to a head, but we preferred that it come to a head than that it not come to a head. The important thing was to foil the imperialist plot, which consisted of staging a coup in August to put a civilian military regime in power and thus put a damper on the revolutionary struggle. The palace operation had to do with the plot. We felt that since we didn't have a large-scale party org, since the working class and the working people in general were not well organized, the only way to make ourselves felt, in political terms, was with weapons. That's why we carried out many operations that were military in form, but profoundly political in content. That was the case in August. It was a military operation which was an outgrowth of a political rather than a military situation. That was also the case in October 1977, when we had to regain the military initiative and counteract a political maneuver. Harnecker. So when some people ask why you called for the September uprising without having achieved the unity of the 3 tendencies, this is explained by Ortega. Conditions for unity did not exist then. First, we had to strengthen the struggle, and all the tendencies were working on this. Little by little, we came to an understanding, but around a line which was called for in practice. It was not our line, but the one the people demanded. After Monimbo, we dissolved the Carlos Fonseca column and sent its members to the nerve centers of economic, social, and political activity in the country. As far as we were concerned, there was no choosing between mountain and city. It was a case of being with the masses. We sent some of the 40 men in the column to Esteli, others to Managua, others to Leon. The column served as a means to educate people. It made possible more all-around training because they were gathered there under the wing of members of the leadership like Herman Pomares and other members of our national leadership. That was how we trained a small group of cadres whom we later sent to the cities to prepare the insurrection, using what we learned in Monimbo. Given all that had happened from October to Monimbo, we held the view that it was necessary to put ourselves at the head of the mass movement in order to prevent the repressive forces from wearing it down. Because if that had happened, no matter how many guerrilla columns we had, victory in the short term was out of the question. The crux of victory was not military in nature. It was the masses' participation in the insurrectional situation. We always struggled to keep the activity of the masses going, and at the end it was showing signs of decline, given the fact that there had been 2 years of uninterrupted activity after October and repression was getting steadily worse. National Guard members would dress up as guerrillas, and since nighttime belonged to the guerrillas, they would move into neighborhoods and kill people. The repression was so severe that some people were starting to fall back. As far as we were concerned, the entire strategy, all the political and military steps taken were focused on the masses, on preventing a decline in their morale. This is why we undertook operations that did not fit within a specific political military plan, but they did serve the purpose of continuing to motivate the masses, to keep the mass movement going in the cities, which in turn allowed us to gain in strength. The masses made it possible for the armed movement to accumulate the forces the masses themselves needed. We strived to keep the masses in action. That's why at times it seemed as though operations were disconnected from a military plan. But in fact, they were in line with a political military strategic situation aimed at keeping the mass movement going because that was the only way to obtain a military victory. Our insurrectional strategy was centered on the masses, not on military considerations. It's important to understand that. Harnecker. But didn't the fact that the emphasis was on urban insurrection as opposed to the guerrilla column lead to an unduly great loss of life and destruction? The fact that the struggle was centered on the cities makes it easier to repress. For example, the bombing of the cities. Ortega. That question is meaningless, because that was the only way to win in Nicaragua. If it had been otherwise, there would never have been a victory. We simply paid the price of freedom. Had there been a less costly means, we would have used it, but reality showed us that in order to win, we had to base ourselves on situations that had been taking shape, for better or for worse, in a disorderly manner, and which implied a very high social price. Trying to tell the masses that the cost was very high and that they should seek another way would have meant the defeat of the revolutionary movement, and more than that, falling into utopianism, paternalism, idealism. Liberation movements must realize that their struggle will be even more costly than ours. I personally can't imagine a victory in Latin America or anywhere else without the large-scale participation of the masses and without a total economic, political, and social crisis similar to the one in Nicaragua. I myself feel it is very difficult to take power without a creative combination of all forms of struggle, whether they can take place. Countryside, city, town, neighborhood, mountain, etc., but was always based on the idea that the mass movement is the focal point of the struggle and not the vanguard, with the masses limited to merely supporting it. Our experience showed that it is possible to combine the struggle in the city and in the countryside. We had struggle in the cities, struggle for the control of means of communication, and struggle in the guerrilla columns in the rural and mountainous areas. But the columns were not the determining factor in bringing about victory. They were simply part of a greater determining factor, which was the armed struggle of the masses. That was the main contribution. In May, after the September developments, the movement gained in military and political strength. The activity of the masses became more far-reaching, the barricades were erected. The daily struggle in the neighborhoods continued. None of this would have been possible had there been a strategic defeat. From September until we launched the offensive in May, the brunt of military activity was borne by the guerrilla columns of the Northern Front and the ones in Nueva Guinea. In rural and mountainous areas, the final offensive began with the capture of El Jicaro in Nueva Segovia. In March, Commander Herman Bomares was active in the area and was able to overpower the enemy garrison and set several ambushes for the National Guard contingents coming to aid the forces defeated at El Jicaro. These operations continued with the capture of Esteli in April by the Carlos Fonseca Northern Front column. Esteli was taken by a guerrilla column, not an uprising. The masses joined in afterwards. Harnecker. But why did you capture a single city again? Isn't that a repetition of the Monimbo experience? Ortega. No, because we weren't defeated in Esteli. The National Guard was unable to rout the guerrilla fighters there. Our comrades withdrew by breaking through the encirclement and demonstrated that thousands of soldiers had been unable to defeat a column of less than 200 men. It's true that the forces used in the capture of Esteli should have been larger. What happened was that orders had been given to carry out a series of operations in the area of Esteli, and our comrades launched a direct attack on the city. These were actions that were within the perimeter of the Northern Front. They were mutual support operations between the forces of the Northern Front, but the situation in the country had deteriorated to such an extent that the capture of the city created a nationwide feeling of expectation that accelerated the insurrectional offensive. After September, the brunt of the war was borne by the guerrilla columns. Sorry, I'm just checking something. The guerrilla columns of the Northern Front. At the same time, all over the country, the militia and the combat units of the Sandinista forces continued to harass the enemy. Hundreds of the regime's henchmen and informers were executed. After the insurrection, the people realized that they had won and were incensed by the repression. Harnecker. In other words, the blows that were being dealt the enemy had a greater effect than the repression. Ortega. A much greater effect. By this time, the people were already experienced in battle, and their thirst for victory was so great that the September crimes, rather than dampening their spirit, strengthened it even more. Everybody had had a relative or friend killed in the struggle, and there was a great thirst for revenge. The people wanted revenge, and we weren't going to go against their wishes. The final offensive began in March 1979 with the capture of El Jicaro. The different tendencies were beginning to unite by then. Everybody was in favor of beginning an offensive in the north, and there was a general consensus regarding the uprising. The capture of El Jicaro was followed by that of Esteli. After Esteli, there was Nueva Guinea, a military setback for us, but it served to bog the enemy down, to wear him down. It cost us 128 men. The plan was correct, but our comrades were unable to cope with a number of tactical problems, and the enemy hit them hard. Harnecker. What was the plan for Nueva Guinea? Ortega. To infiltrate a column there, to bog the enemy down, to carry out guerrilla ops. This would create the conditions in the rest of the country for carrying out political military work in the cities once the National Guard was dispersed. The repression would be less because the National Guard would be bogged down in Nueva Guinea. But instead of sticking to guerrilla warfare, our comrades operated on flat terrain and became an easy target for the enemy. Harnecker. In other words, by then, the center of the struggle had shifted to the guerrilla units. Ortega. The mass movement did not allow the enemy to concentrate all its military force against the columns, and, at the same time, the columns' operations forced the enemy to go out in search of them. This, in turn, made the mass struggle in the cities a little easier. The enemy found himself in a dead end. If he left the cities, the mass movement would get the upper hand, and if he remained, this would help the guerrilla columns' operations. Harnecker. This way of organizing the armed struggle, was it planned beforehand, or was it something that you learned as you went along? Ortega. Well, there are things that you learn in the course of the struggle and use to your advantage. We knew that it would be that way. We planned an operation in the north to force the National Guard to go there, giving us a chance to better organize the rest of the country. Sorry. Okay, so that's about 10 pages, guys. I'm going to pause the reading of Sandinista Speak. What'd y'all think? I think it's just so cool, man, how a revolutionary is being interviewed. You get their respective guys. How did they do it? How did they organize? What kind of tactics they used? What kind of horrible tactics that the Somoza dictatorship, whose army's trained by the United States. You can look up the School of the Americas. You can look it up right now, guys. They call it WinSec now. WHINSEC, Western Hemisphere for like security cooperation or something. The United States trains dictators, death squads, torture squads, and how to oppress people and kill people. So, all right, we're going to continue today's book reading session. We're going to switch to something a little less serious, some video game history. I'm going to go use the bathroom and drink some water. Give me just a second, please. Thank you. Jesus, I'm still sick, guys. All right, hello. Thank you for waiting. Let me just update my folks over here. Shit. Fuck. Let's continue the book reading session today. Da-da-da. Going to talk about World of Warcraft. Read 50 key. Games specifically. Guitar Hero. Sorry, guys. And Minecraft. Alright, so let's see. Alright, let's continue. Sorry about that, guys. I have to update my stream so people know what I'm talking about over here. Alright, guys, so let's 50 key video games. The last 3 games we talked about were Half-Life from 1998, Animal Crossing from 2001, and Grand Theft Auto 3 from 2001. I would like to talk about today the next 3 on this list of my choosing. As you can see, I'm not reading every single one. Can you get a good look at that? So definitely skipping a few. I'd never be able to finish this book otherwise. And I don't want to read every word, guys, because I want you guys to support these authors and editors and their hard work, and I don't want to spoil it all. I want you guys to check this book out, okay? So, it's a select reading, as you can say. So, let's load up Guitar Hero. I'm going to skip World of Warcraft. Let's read about Guitar Hero, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and Minecraft. I feel like those will be some fun ones. You know, they're such well-known games, and I kind of just want to get some history on them. So let's go to page 129. All right, let's see. Page 129. All right. So here we go. 50 key video games. Let's continue. Let's read the introduction to Guitar Hero on page 129. Introducing rhythm games. Whether used as a tool to communicate with the player or implemented to create atmosphere and ambience, almost all video games have some musical element to them. Then there are games that put the music front and center as a primary gameplay mechanic. Within the music and rhythm genre, gameplay is most often tied to keeping the beat of the music, often through a unique controller in a range of play context. From dance games such as Dance Dance Revolution, 1998, Just Dance from 2009, to games that aim to put the player in the role of a musician such as Guitar Freak from 1998, Rock Band, 2007, among many others. The use of popular music has grounded the genre firmly within the broader video game landscape. The genre has steadily expanded beyond simple mimicry, as seen through games that use rhythm as an auditory cue for core gameplay, such as Beat Saber, 2018, where the player must dodge oncoming obstacles to the beat of the music, or Audica, from 2019, where the player must shoot targets on the ever-increasing beat. Though the music and rhythm genre has had a steady, yet often low-key level of success over the years, arguably it is the Guitar Hero franchise from 2005 to 2015 that has seen the most mainstream success and longevity within the genre. In what would become the first game of the franchise, Guitar Hero was developed by Harmonix, published by Red Octane, and released on the PlayStation 2 in 2005 in North America, 2006 in Europe, and Australia. Though there have been other games that aim to teach players how to play the guitar, such as Rocksmith in 2011 and Bandfuse Rock Legends from 2014, the aim of Guitar Hero was not to teach the player how to play an actual guitar, but to mimic the overarching movements of playing guitar. The game gave the player just enough referential information so they felt like they were playing, but without the dexterity and mental challenges of learning real musical chords, allowing players to immerse themselves in the guitar player fantasy in their own homes. Let's read the next subchapter. Let's read the next little bullet point here. Playing Guitar Hero, in parentheses. The 2005 release of the game was packaged with a black and white 3/4 scale model of a Gibson SG guitar with an adjustable strap. replacing the PlayStation standard handheld controller in its traditional input buttons, the classic green triangle, red circle, blue cross, and pink square. They said blue cross, it's an X button. Let's see. The gameplay input on the stringless plastic guitar controller consisted of 5 colored buttons: green, red, yellow, blue, and orange, each spanning the width of their own fret on the neck of the guitar. The guitar came equipped with a whammy bar, which was used for collecting power-ups and changing the pitch of the notes, most often used to collect more points, and a white strum bar, which the player moved up and down while pushing down the appropriate colored buttons to simulate its strumming. It also included 2 navigation buttons, where tone and volume knobs would otherwise be, to enable the player to access the main and option menus. The plastic guitar was lighter and smaller than the Gibson SG it was modeled after, affording the player to interact with the game through the imagined skills and movements of playing guitar, but it was in no way an actual simulation. Before starting the game, players could select a character from 8 preset options. This character would perform on stage during gameplay, though they had no bearing on the actual gameplay or the game's progression. In career mode, players were able to customize elements of the character and purchase different guitars. Interestingly, while the player selects the character, the gameplay perspective faces the stage so the player can see the band, including the character they selected, which implies that the character selected is not actually the player, but is a fellow bandmate. Further, while the player could purchase different in-game guitars, the visual representation of the game did not translate to any change in the actual plastic guitar the player used to play the game, nor did it change any of its functionality. On the bottom center of the screen sits the image of a large fretted guitar neck where the notes scroll by at varying paces depending on the difficulty level. Basic gameplay consisted of matching the notes on their guitar to the scrolling notes on the screen by pressing down on the correlated colored buttons on the neck of the guitar. If the player missed a note, they would lose points. To successfully complete a song, the player must match a certain number of notes to achieve a rating of at least 3 stars out of 5. As songs are completed successfully, more tour locations and set lists become accessible. Even in a crowded room, gameplay could often become mesmerizing as the player focused on the scrolling musical notes speeding across the screen, while simultaneously trying to hone their dexterity to match the notes on the guitar. After several hours of gameplay, it was not uncommon to log off and still see the scrolling notes before one's closed eyes. This residual post-play visual effect increased as the difficulty levels were amped up and the player was required to concentrate and react to the increasing pace of gameplay. Difficulty levels focused on both the speed of the scrolling notes and the complexity of the button combinations. For example, when playing on easy, the player only uses the red and green buttons, whereas on hard, the player uses all 5 buttons, challenging the player's dexterity and concentration abilities. With the option to play either career mode or quick play in 3 difficulty levels, the player can power their way through sets of 6 songs to unlock more content, or select any unlocked song, pick a difficulty level, and jump right in. This core gameplay of scrolling notes on the screen followed over into other harmonics games, including Rock Band from '07, a cooperative game where you can play up to 4 people on guitar, bass, drums, and vocals, each with its own unique plastic peripheral. While other games within the franchise expanded the gameplay by introducing multiplayer elements, battle and co-op, and a new guitar with a different button scheme with each release, the core gameplay remains the same regardless of platform and controller. At the heart of Guitar Hero experience, there is always the plastic guitar. I'm going to skip this little subplot about the plastic guitar, and I'm going to read the next bullet point. Because remember, guys, this is a select reading. I want you guys to buy this book. I don't want to spoil everything for you. The next bullet point is social gameplay. Music brings people together. Although the first Guitar Hero is a single-player game, the performative nature of the gameplay meant that people often played the game in a range of social settings, from small groups gathering in domestic environments to more public venues such as birthday parties, team building events. Bars, players, and spectators alike would cheer each other on, laugh, and even help each other complete a song to unlock more options, or so they don't have to hear yet another failed attempt. Guitar Hero becomes such a popular social event beyond the living room that some bars even hosted Guitar Hero nights, similar to karaoke, where players got up on stage and performed a song from the game's unlocked playlist. The better the player was, the more they could perform without looking at the screen with the notes scrolling behind them and focus on entertaining the crowd, while ideally hitting every note perfectly. While there may have been prizes for the best performance, it is clear that one of the main draws for entrants was the opportunity to live out their dream of being a guitar hero. Even more with the opportunity to be on a real stage in front of a real audience cheering and booing them on. Further to the appeal of the performance of the player as spectacle, it could be argued that the soundtrack and set lists were another strong element that contributed to the game's and franchise's success. The main set list ranged from Motorhead's Ace of Spades and David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust to the Ramones' I Want to Be Sedated and the Red Hot Chili Peppers' Higher Ground. Anyone familiar with popular rock and roll from the late 60s onwards would recognize at least some, if not all, of the songs in the game. While the 2005 release of the game had all cover versions rather than original recordings, they were performed as close to the originals as possible. Players could also purchase 17 bonus songs with their in-game earnings from Career Mode. These songs were more obscure and performed by the original artist. It was a novel way of introducing players to new music, especially given the fact that players often had to play many times over to successfully complete a song and get a high score. Whether the player was interested in playing out their rock star dreams or simply wanted to unlock as many songs as possible, the music selection, ranging from classic rock hits to lesser known alternative songs, the game had something for everyone. Future releases within the franchise would focus on specific bands or eras, and even included motion capture of the artist to lend an air of authenticity to in-game performances. But arguably, it was the increasing use of popular mainstream music that kept players coming back for more, challenging themselves and their friends to unlock more songs. Guitar Hero players and spectators alike want to be able to play and sing along to something they already know, to be able to play their favorite song or travel down a nostalgic road of musical favorites. Undoubtedly, the use of mainstream popular music contributed to the game's success as a performative and social gaming experience that helped kickstart the growing trend in social rhythm games such as Rock Band and Just Dance to use music the target audience would be familiar with. All right, here's a small bullet point I want to read. Finish this up. Setting the stage for the franchise and the future of music and rhythm video games. While many other games in the music and rhythm genre have been released since 2005 that are memorable and fun to play, Guitar Hero has helped put popular music at the forefront of game design, using it as a core gameplay mechanic instead of being relegated to an atmospheric tool or narrative device. Through embodied gameplay, unique peripheral controllers, and familiar if not nostalgic musical favorites, the game clearly set the stage for players to live out their rockstar fantasies in the comfort of their living rooms. By Kelly Boudreau. Sweet. Well, there you go. There's Guitar Hero. Let's continue with the next game. I want to read Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. This is going to be fun. From 2009. This is on page 44. All right, let's continue to read. Page 44. Here we go. Introduction. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 by Infinity Ward, 2009. The sixth iteration of the Call of Duty franchise and a direct sequel to a reinvention of the series, fused closely to its predecessors in terms of its aesthetic, design, and gameplay. As a war game, it signals a profound change in the representation of military conflict, turning the domestic spaces where the game is played into the battlefield where war unfolds. As it represents the symbolic leveling of American suburbia, the game also upends ideas sacrosanct to its predecessors, specifically that American led military conflict is just and that its enemies are clearly defined, and that the U.S. and its allies are safe due to their spatial distance from conflict and the temporal distance of history. Invoking the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, representing an aerial assault on the United States that clearly recalls 9/11, and making playable a terrorist attack on an airport, Modern Warfare 2's topicality foregrounds a willingness to depict violence that is brutal even by the genre standards, discursively contextualizing it as realistic, or at least knowable, through references to TV and cinema. Simultaneously, the narrative's characters bluntly rationalize engaging in such violence as a way to seize power and subvert the historical record, with a performative display of self-censorship, allowing players to skip a level that the game itself deems potentially too graphic, even for fans of militarized shooters. Modern Warfare 2 situates itself as unique within the Modern Warfare series, Call of Duty as a franchise, and the genre as a whole. Few games that represent such spectacular levels of violence have such an uneasy relationship with their performance, and few military shooters prior to Modern Warfare 2 depict contemporary military conflict as wholly uncontainable and fundamentally egoistic. Egoistic? Let's see. Let's read the next bullet point, titled Standard Formation, Aesthetic and Narrative Design. Modern Warfare 2 does little to innovate the military shooter subgenre or the Call of Duty franchise, instead utilizing established game mechanics and streamlining design elements from previous titles that benefit from player familiarity. As is standard in first-person shooters, the player is represented on screen by the weapon they carry, which is the locus of interactivity. The goal is to dominate space through violent means, and interaction focuses primarily on pointing and shooting available weapons at oncoming enemies, tactically or frenetically, and avoiding damage from an increasingly overwhelming onslaught. The layout of the visual field, the heads-up display or HUD, and the info it contains communicate immediate objectives, pertinent information such as remaining ammunition and health, and nearby locations of interest. Although populating the visual field with information, either narrational or actionable, was not new or to first-person shooters. Modern Warfare 2's aesthetics emphasize militarism, with objectives and information displayed in a typeface that replicates official government memoranda, and glowing neon symbols on the minimap invoking night vision colors that have been associated with televised warfare since the Persian Gulf War. Additionally, the weapons to which the player has access are all faithful replicas of real military hardware, painstakingly reproduced with an attention to detail that includes incorporating the sound the weapons make when discharging, continuing Call of Duty's valorization of weaponry's technical minutiae. This, the player is told, is how war looks and feels. Much as Modern Warfare 2 replicates its predecessors in aesthetics, interface design, and gameplay, the game utilizes a narrational template present from the first iterations of the franchise, intertwining the stories of a multinational group of soldiers fighting from different vantage points against a common foe. In Call of Duty 2, for example, the player must defend Moscow as a Soviet private, stage an attack on German troops in North Africa as a British sergeant, and participate in D-Day as an American corporal, always pressing forward into German-occupied territory. The stories of these soldiers are told both through the play of individual levels and through intro-level cutscenes that simultaneously work to provide expository grounding for the ensuing action of gameplay and communicate the trajectory of the war itself. In Call of Duty World at War 2008, Kiefer Sutherland's voiceover contextualizes statistics in World War II film footage, celebrating the determination of the war effort and situating the forthcoming battle in a larger unfolding history, retold with an eye toward factual detail. These cutscenes provide an air of verisimilitude to the ensuing action and embody, through their juxtaposition with gameplay, the multiple modes of historical representation possible. Modern Warfare 2 continues this tradition of representing war as multifaceted and vast, yet it notably eschews the historical accuracy its predecessors embellished in favor of speculative fantasy, portraying the goal of military conflict as the erasure of history itself. All right, we're going to skip the next bullet point, and let's read the last bullet point. Impact. Genre influence. Modern Warfare 2's immense popularity, selling over 14 million copies, makes the game a profoundly visible example of the military shooter's changing relationship to warfare's representation. Though the Call of Duty, Battlefield, and Medal of Honor franchises all began by representing World War II era combat, they turned to contemporary militarized conflict in the mid-2000s. Modern Warfare 2 only accelerated this trend, with the game's influence felt over its own direct sequels and later entries in the franchise, notably Call of Duty Black Ops 2, 2012, which focuses on both historical clandestine military operations and a futuristic Cold War. Competing franchises concocted fictional warfare across the Middle East, China, Africa, and notably America itself, with a strand of increasingly fantastical FPS titles, notably Homefront from 2011, Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus from 2017, depicting the United States as an occupied battlefield. None, however, would be as audacious in their brash topicality or their uncomfortable brutality. Given its profitability, acclaim, and influence, it can easily be forgotten that Modern Warfare 2 does not simply endorse the conflict it represents and the violence it imagines. It stands in difficult relation to them, critiquing contemporary war as waged at the whim of those in power, and with a far-reaching impact on the innocent, arguing that in global conflict, collateral damage cannot be contained. Its gameplay is at once exciting and thrilling, but also overwhelming and viciously brutal. Nonetheless, it deems only some of its content disturbing and offensive, implying that armed military conflict in general should not be considered to be either. Indeed, no matter the in-game obstacle, violence is always the only solution. While helping thrust an entire subgenre into the present and bringing war home in a way that rippled beyond military games, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 interrogates both the impetus for and the breadth of contemporary warfare, proposing that the erasure of history from both war and its representation as consumable, commodifiable entertainment results in spectacular and violent excess. By Harrison Gish. All right, there's Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Let's go to Minecraft, y'all. Minecraft is such a huge game. I just want to read that section, although I can give two you-know-who's about Minecraft. It's such a huge game and franchise. I just want to read some of the cool statistics about it. So, okay, so this is page 159. Here's the introduction to Minecraft from 2009. What's wrong? Sorry, cat was hissing. Anyway, Minecraft. It is hard to overstate the significance of Minecraft. As I write this, it is the best-selling video game ever, by September 2021, it had sold over 238 million copies, and the free Chinese version had been downloaded over 400 million times. It is also one of the most well known games, with 90% of the US online population aware of Minecraft. It is historically and culturally significant for its distinctive aesthetic, accessible gameplay, indie development process, modifiability, and massive popular adoption as a platform for artistic, educational, or virtual world goals. Minecraft is a sandbox game that can be played on mobile, computer, console, or in VR. Represented by a blocky avatar, a player breaks and places cubes of different materials in a procedurally generated three-dimensional environment that spawns non-player character creatures, some of which are hostile. Players can choose different modes of gameplay, including creative mode, in which they have unlimited resources, can fly, cannot die, or survival mode, in which they avoid dying by gathering or mining and crafting materials into shelter and other resources, and maintaining levels of health and hunger. Swedish programmer Marcus Notch Persson, Persson, created it in the Java programming language and initially released it on the independent game developer online forum TIG Source, and then as a public alpha in 2009. Mojang, the independent game development company Persson founded, released Minecraft in beta in 2010 and the full version in 2011. In 2014, Mojang, now Mojang Studios, was acquired by Microsoft Game Studios, now Xbox Game Studios. As of this writing in 2021, the game continues to grow as a cultural phenomenon. Minecraft is often described as a computer game version of Lego because of its looks and unstructured play. It is characterized by a high degree of player agency. Players choose whether resources are infinite or mined, whether objectives are set for them, whether they play alone or with others, and whether they modify the look and or the mechanics of the game they purchased. Let's read the next bullet point, distinctive aesthetics. Minecraft's distinctive aesthetic is based on pixelated graphics, cubic blocks, melodic ambient and piano music, first-person perspective with abstracted avatars, and procedurally generated content. These and other elements contribute to the distinctive blend of look, sound, movement, and game feel that comprise its aesthetics. Minecraft's juxtaposition of blockiness with beauty, of unyielding horizontal and vertical constraint, with the unlimited possibilities of transformation sets it apart. It is stimulating, but the details in the game don't overwhelm the player's imagination. Everything is abstracted, dialing down the demanding details of everyday life. A Minecraft world is a place of possibility, of fun, and for many, of nostalgia. The Minecraft aesthetic is expressed in every aspect of the game. It is found in the visual style. The square, pixelated look of Minecraft blocks, the tones of monochromatic colors, and the iconic recognizability of non-block items like flowers, rails, and carrots, reminiscent of needlepoint and beadwork. It is communicated in movement, flowing lava, the way avatars move, how beings in the world respond to proximity. It is perhaps most profoundly experienced in Persson's choices of music, sound design, and additional content, all of which originated in the indie game community. The achingly beautiful ambient melodic music of composers C418 Daniel Rosenfield and, more recently, Lena Raine, and the sounds of creepers, villagers, and other entities in the world are not what players heard in other games in 2009. When Persson decided to give Minecraft the win condition that appears after the Ender Dragon has been defeated, he chose the brilliant and unusual writer Julian Gauff to create an 8-minute scrolling text to conclude the game that makes clear the ancient ties between creativity and survival, and the wonder of collaboration, cooperation, and community, both in its world and the reality on the other side of the screen. First-person perspective was a key factor that person added to Infinite Miner, the open source block construction game that inspired the first iterations of what he made into Minecraft. Equally significant was the engagingly abstracted avatar, who, like the world, is devoid of curves and comprised of pixels. Similar to a pointillist painting made with a crayon, an avatar's face peers back at you when you toggle the third-person camera mode or see another player. As Scott McCloud insightfully comments about comics, you have no choice but to fill in the gaps. Icons demand our participation to make them work. There is no life here except that which you give to it. All right, let's read one more bullet point here. Accessible, scalable gameplay. Minecraft is characterized by accessible and versatile gameplay, with multiple game modes, cross-platform play across devices, and limitless replayability. The core gameplay of punching trees, of placing and destroying blocks are all easy to do. Players can choose how much risk they want when they choose between the play modes. Creative or spectator for low risk, and survival, adventure, or hardcore as variations with scarce resources and the possibility of losing one's items in game death. 4 difficulty settings: peaceful, easy, normal, and hard, allow players to further modulate their risk. There are multiple ways to play Minecraft by oneself or with others. Multiplayer is varied, with subscriptions to Mojang hosted private Minecraft Realms servers, local area networks in a single location, one of the handful of featured servers on Bedrock, or one of the thousands from the Java edition. Additionally, Minecraft has unlimited replayability. Each unique, procedurally generated world is a navigable space with places ready to be explored and discovered, and it can be further fashioned by players. The world is created anew. As players grow in age, interests, and skills, Minecraft grows with them. What might engage a young player may cease to fascinate a tween or teen, but they can shift to harder survival modes, challenge themselves with redstone, explore, make animations, participate in a lore server that has a narrative, or endeavor to build more extensively. Wherever you are, on whatever device, you can play Minecraft and connect with friends. With the Better Together update in 2017, Mojang established one of the most extensive systems for unifying cross-platform play so players can use their account across devices and platforms. As of September 2021, Minecraft Bedrock, coded in C++, can be played on Xbox One, mobile, Android, mobile iOS, Android VR, Nintendo Switch, PS4, 5, and Windows 10 devices. The original Java edition allows cross-platform play across Mac, Windows, and Linux computers. Moreover, Minecraft has benefited from Microsoft's commitment to accessibility in gaming. For example, a group of 2019 Microsoft Garage interns, sponsored by the Minecraft education team, used inclusive design to build features that improve accessibility for the autism community, while also enhancing accessibility for everyone. Both the recent Dungeon Crawler standalone game Minecraft Dungeons and Minecraft ranked in the top 15 games with accessibility features out of 740 games reviewed. Alright, there's a couple more bullet points, but I'll leave that for y'all's imagination and for y'all to read one day. Boom, guys. So, we're going to do one more stream of 50 key video games. This is the second to last stream. I'll read 3 more games. I'm not sure which ones I'll read yet. So, hold your pants or hold your horses? I don't know what I'm talking about. Alright. Well, thanks for hanging out, guys. On top of the video game book I read, I also read Sandinista Speak, some history in Nicaragua of how they are oppressed by the United States imperialism. I'll chop these up, edit them up, and this is me going live, this video, but I will kind of edit out me going to the bathroom and stuff. And, you know, I'm releasing them an intro, part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So stay tuned for that. But currently playing Wicked Seed, the new indie survival horror game on PC, Steam. I just beat Tearscaped, and that is old school. It plays like old school Zelda with Dark Souls mechanics. Just beat it, guys. Took us about 11 hours. We stayed up till like 1:30 when I was supposed to go to bed at like 11:30. I'm tired as hell, dude. So I may or may not play some games later, okay? But thank you for